Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Murrell here with my review of Backrooms, which is the latest buzzy horror film that looks to dominate the box office this weekend. It is the feature directorial debut of Kane Parsons, a young filmmaker who rose to fame, making a series of videos right here on YouTube about the Backrooms, an endless series of empty, terrifyingly sterile rooms that exist outside of reality in which you are both hopelessly alone and perhaps terrifyingly not alone. The concept of the backroom started as what's called creepypasta, or for us old folks, creepy posts and internet forums, and it's those posts and pictures that Kane Parsons looked to for inspiration when he was making the original Backroom short films for YouTube. In a year where YouTube filmmakers are having a huge moment at the box office, this movie is maybe the most tied to the ever-changing internet culture, which is probably why this film wasn't even on my radar when I was looking at summer movies until I released my predictions, and a lot of people said, well, wait a minute, you're sleeping on Backrooms. It is a movie that is a must-see for many Gen Z and Gen Alpha audience members, and I think that that's a good thing for film. We've seen internet creepypasta turned into generic horror films before, most notably in 2018's critically reviled Slender Man, but that movie was a studio co-opting internet culture to capitalize on a trend and real-life notoriety. Backrooms actually feels inspired and like it has something to say because it is actually made by an artist who did draw inspiration from the subject matter. It's not just a studio trying to co-opt what the kids are into these days. Backrooms stars Chiwetel Ejiofor as Clark, the owner of a low-rent furniture store and a frustrated wannabe architect. When he discovers a portal to the backrooms in the bottom floor of his store, he doesn't know what to make of this strange and terrifying world. His therapist, Mary, played by Renata Reinsve, doesn't know what to make of Clark's claims, but soon also finds herself drawn into whatever this new discovery is. Backrooms is very inspired by the concept of liminal spaces, which became big on the internet right around the time of COVID, when the whole world became one big liminal space. Liminal spaces is just big, open, empty rooms and places where it's even more creepy because there are no humans there. The Apple TV show Severance is another recent project that took a lot of inspiration from the look and the idea of liminal spaces, and you can see that inspiration in both that show and this movie if you look at them side by side. Consequently, Backrooms, especially in the first half, is very dependent on mood, vibes, and atmosphere, and could have been pretty dull in the hands of somebody who doesn't know how to pull that off, that kind of mood. But Parsons, I think, pulls it off pretty nicely. Clark's initial exploration of the Backrooms is suitably creepy, mainly because Parsons knows when to let the atmosphere take over and when to ratchet up some tension that someone or something else is lurking around somewhere. This is supported by cinematographer Jeremy Cox, a collaborator with Osgood Perkins, who shot his last film, Keeper. The Backrooms have a uniform look, but never a boring one, mainly due to the presence of bizarre sights like stacked furniture, signs printed backwards, and some other horrors lurking deeper within. The production design on this movie is really, really good. I also liked the film's use of mixed media, sometimes using grainy camcorder footage, fitting for the early 90s setting of the movie, which adds to the tense atmosphere because it's just another reason to squint at the screen while being a little scared of what you might find. The two main characters, Clark and Mary, also aren't just avatars, empty human beings that are placed into the concept of the Backrooms. They have their own backstories and their own traumas, which are both explored deeply in the film and are critical to the themes and the messaging of the film. I do think the movie could have beefed up the connective tissue a little bit between the human story and the more horrific elements of the Backrooms, but it does treat its human characters like humans, which is sorely missing in a lot of horror films. And I appreciate that the script, which is written by Will Sudik, takes the time to both set up and pay off the people on screen and not just the setting. Ejiofor and Reinsve also turn in strong performances, as you would expect from actors of their caliber. Backrooms is creepy throughout, but it is not a jump scare filled generic horror film, which I think it very easily could have been. There are some jump scares here and there, but they're sprinkled throughout and they're well executed. Instead, the movie is much more focused on this air of mystery. What exactly is happening in the Backrooms? And the answers that you get are opaque and leave a lot to interpretation, but not in a way that makes the script or the story feel like it's underbaked or underwritten. It feels like Parsons wants to let you do some of the interpreting while sprinkling clues and hints throughout the film, possible solutions. This may frustrate some viewers, but I think it mostly does the open to interpretation thing right, which should lead to some lively discussion after the film. And I think you could have tightened the script up just a little bit without sacrificing the mystery that's key to the heart of the film. But ultimately, I think it arrives at the right destinations, which can excuse some of the bumpiness along the way. Backrooms hits on the heels of a surprise horror sensation, Obsession, which just dethroned the latest Star Wars movie as the #1 movie in America on Wednesday. And while this won't be as much of a surprise hit as Obsession was, as I mentioned, a lot of people said at the beginning of the summer that this movie was positioned to do very well, people more plugged into the internet culture than I am. I think it's still going to surprise some people who maybe still didn't see this movie coming. What I will say about this movie versus Obsession is that this is a bit more of an abstract film than that movie is. So if you are a horror fan, I would go in expecting something with Backrooms that's a little bit more fitting of the A24 branding than what we got with Obsession, but I think that they're both good movies in very different ways and still inside of that horror genre. Of course, both Curry Barker, the director of Obsession, and Kane Parsons got their start on YouTube, and their emergence gives me a lot of hope for this generation of filmmakers. For all of the flack that the quote-unquote YouTube generation has gotten, I think that what we've seen from a lot of or most of the YouTubers that have turned filmmaker has been really good. It hasn't been slop. It hasn't been lowest common denominator stuff. And these were people that were born into YouTube, not people who merely adopted it, like me. By and large, these movies have been well-crafted, thematically rich, thoughtful, and they make simple concepts interesting by layering in complicated characters. That's certainly the case with both Obsession and Backrooms, and it's paying off literally. And obviously, some of the biggest current names in horror saw the promise in this project early on because the producers on Backrooms include both James Wan and Osgood Perkins. I've said for a long time that one of my favorite things about YouTube is that it democratizes creativity because things like professional grade equipment and visual effects tools and editing tools and a platform where you can find an audience for so long were locked up behind the industry doors. And that's not the case with YouTube anymore. What we see now is a generation of filmmakers coming up that have learned by doing, that have learned their craft and found their creative voice by making videos and putting them on YouTube instead of, in many cases, a more formal film school education, which used to be one of the only ways that you could ever hope to break into making movies. Now, that's not to slam film school or diminish it as a form of education. I think that that route also works for a lot of filmmakers, and maybe that's the best way to go for them. But I think that what we're seeing is that creativity flourishes with opportunity. And YouTube and other social media platforms have filled an opportunity vacuum that existed for decades. I mean, the doors that are being opened by making things on YouTube now are doors that didn't even exist 20 years ago. I think that maybe it's a little common for older audiences, and yes, older critics like me, I've got to face reality now, to maybe feel a little bit threatened when films start popping up that are directed by younger filmmakers, that are perhaps aimed at younger audiences, that are steeped in culture that it feels like passes us older folks by because it's what the kids are actually into. But I'm not threatened by that. I think it's actually pretty exciting. I'm happy to see that filmmakers of this new and upcoming generation are putting more thought and innovation into a lot of their films than what we see in many mainstream studio films. I have taken a lot of grief for some of my thoughts on Obsession, and I understand where people are coming from who disagree with me, but I also did like the movie, and I would take that movie and this movie any day over any number of paint-by-numbers horror films that are released every single year. The fact that people left Obsession, and I think we'll leave this one talking about the characters, the themes, the aesthetics of these movies, is a huge win for movies in general. And it's showing that this younger generation, at least in the horror genre, are filmmakers who want to challenge audiences and excite audiences. This kind of generational handoff has been what's kept movies alive decade after decade, and it feels like we are perhaps at the start of a new era. And if this is indeed the start of a new era, then the future of horror, at least, looks very, very bright. So on my personal rating scale, I'm giving Backrooms a rating of it's good. It may frustrate some viewers, but even if it does, it's not out of laziness or a lack of thought. It's just not a film that wants to give you easy answers. Still, I think there's a lot to talk about. I love the cinematography. I love the acting. I love the mystery. I love the tone. There was a lot in this movie that I really, really liked. But what do you think? Were you into the Backrooms shorts on YouTube and the creepypasta and everything else much more than I was? What did you think of the movie? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned right here for the latest in movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.